thank you so much. And I want to echo some of the things that Sarah said. Thank you, of course, for being invited to participate among this wonderful group of speakers. But really a thank you to those of us who've joined us from their busy schedules today around this topic that, from my standpoint, is critical to the health of our most precious, which is our kids. So I just really appreciate the people from so many different backgrounds taking the time to talk about this topic today. A little bit about disclosures. This presentation is about stigma and bias. And so while I won't be, I don't have any financial relationships to disclose, and I won't be talking about any off-label of anything, as an individual, I am susceptible to bias and may wittingly and unwittingly participate in stigma systems. And so I just want to acknowledge that as part of my disclosures. It is time to take out your phones. I know often during meetings and during conferences and things like that, we say, put your phones away. No, please take them out, because we're going to, in one short minute, participate in a little group activity. My hope is with the objectives, you can read them right there. But this little chat, what I hope to do is add a couple of thought threads for us to share and weaving throughout today's content, and hopefully in conversations that continue after that, after today. So we're going to get warmed up first with a little bit of an activity. This is where you're going to need to have your phones. But right now, what I'd like you to do is take a minute to read what's on your screen, keeping in mind what X is. Thinking about X, and I'll give us a minute to do that. Give us a few more seconds before I change the screen. Okay, now I'm going to move on. I'm going to have you do, again, let's take out that phone, open up a browser on your phone, and navigate over to menti.com as written on your screen. And then when prompted, please go ahead and put that code in, because it would allow you to put in some of your responses. You're able to put up, it should be up to 2 responses. And what I want people to be thinking about is, what's the first things that came to mind when you thought about what X is? Okay, this is wonderful. And so as those responses to continue to come in, and feel free, those who haven't entered them yet, to keep doing that. I want to point a couple of things out. I've done this a number of times before, and a lot of the responses are very similar. Does it surprise anyone? It looks like for some people not, to know that in this instance, and this is from a site called an organization called childtrends.org, and they collect a lot of different information and put it together about different things that health things that impact our children. And this one in particular is actually about parental depression, even though they mostly refer to maternal in the text. And so I don't know if it comes as a surprise to somebody, what they're referring to is depression. Substance use, though, is one of the majority of our minds goes to first. And certainly in terms of downstream effects, substance use, depression, living in poverty are ones that are associated with child neglect and abuse, but don't cause them. And isn't it also interesting, number one, that substance use is the one that comes up more frequently, or most is at the front of people's thinking. And so I want to stress a couple of things. One is, while these are associations with child abuse and neglect, they don't cause them. None of them. Poverty doesn't cause it. Depression doesn't cause it. Substance use doesn't cause it. That they're associated. And it's also interesting that I notice in here we're also coming up with more upstream effects, system effects that contribute to the stress that people feel, that contribute to the lack of resources, et cetera, that people might have, that contribute to the stress that they feel. It's not often the first thing that we come up with. We often come up with these more individual behavioral expressions or stress responses that people have in response to circumstances. So it's interesting, and I'm going to bring this up a little bit later about upstream consequences aren't mentioned as often as these other ones. The other is, with substance use being first, that does represent, there's a bias towards substance use being one that we go to first, and it's part of the stigmatization process. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Thank you for participating. There are many ways to define stigma. One of the more popularized ones is from the sociologist Irving Goffman. Many of the definitions people come up with have a lot in common. I chose this one because it's a really kind of clear one that I think we can have as a shared definition. And stigma is an attribute that can be shared by certain group members that links a person to an undesirable stereotype. So it's not a positive thing. It's a mark or a branding, and that's where the term stigma comes from in the first place. And it lends other people to reduce that person from a whole person to one that is tainted or discounted. So it's the part of a process of making them different, other, and at some point separating them from the same resources or benefits that the other group gets. And so it really is, whether intentional or not, and stigma acts don't necessarily have to be intentional, but it is the idea, number one, like I said, that it's whether it's something that you can see, skin color, whether it's something that we find out about somebody, whether it's spiritual beliefs or their history of substance use or having depressive symptoms, et cetera. But that attribute is what gets tied to stereotypes that get generated and then lends itself, as we'll see, to aspects of discrimination. And one might argue, and the argument has been made, that stigma is there with the intent to discriminate against certain groups. And how did those relate? And I was asked to relate, how do we relate stigma to discrimination? Well, in the theorizing around stigma, stigma is ultimately intended to discriminate. It's intended to isolate, to mark certain people with this certain the characteristic with this group, make links to different types of stereotyping, and coming up with justifications for keeping people from taking advantage of certain resources that other groups are able to do. Some parts of this, one would be labeling. And it's assigning an attribute to a person or a place. That would be calling them, rather than just referring them to them as a person, is identifying them as an addict, as a pothead, as, we can all come up with a bunch of different words. Stereotyping is where there might be some aspects of a characteristic or beliefs about people that may be true of some people. It becomes generalized to become true about all of them and taken to be true about all of them. And particular for people who struggle with substance use, maybe that they're dishonest, that they're unreliable, that they're selfish. In some instances, there's arrested development or stunted development, and that they're not able to problem solve or take care of themselves, in that way. How that relates to discrimination, in part, again, is those beliefs becoming a justification, a defended justification for socially excluding people and barring them from being able to take advantage of certain resources. For example, here are things like discrimination in housing, discrimination in employment, et cetera. There are multiple different spheres of stigma, and it's about more than words, which is what I'll end up talking about a little bit. This is from the National Alliance on Mental Illness. One could come up with different names for the different groups. and say that there are more and label them differently, but enough to say that there are multiple layers at which stigma is experienced. And a lot of our anti-stigma conversations often end up being about the individual and about words. And I want to focus a bit more on making sure that we remember aspects of things like structural stigma and things like label avoidance and perceived stigma, which come up a lot in terms of how people may interact with me um, clinically, but also explaining, help explain why individuals or families may be engaging with us in particular ways that get characterized differently. And I'll give you a couple of examples. But on the individual basis, in terms of how I may interact with somebody over my biases or beliefs, is in the realm of that public or social stigma. Self-stigma, which we'll talk a little bit more about, is internalized. It's when that person starts to really identify with certain negative stereotyping beliefs that other people talk about and internalize that and start to believe and behave in accordance with that themselves. What I've become particularly sensitive to lately is called perceived stigma. So oftentimes I try to remember, this is what I hold myself responsible for, is I may behave differently. I may be trying really hard to be aware of stigma and counteract that in interactions with patients and families. They have had multiple different experiences outside of the ones with me. So part of what I'm responsible for is recognizing that. And also when they act with me in a way that seems like they're expecting that from me, my job is, from my perspective, is to continue to prove myself, because there's a lot of undoing based on the experiences they've had with other people and with other parts of systems. And so there's a reason they interact with me that way. And it has to do in part with expectations of me, that I may behave towards them in ways that they're used to having been treated. Another important one, especially among kids, is this idea of, some people call it label avoidance. And a lot of how I've seen it is, again, either fears based on what's actually already happened, or just fears because they're kids and they draw conclusions about what might happen, and will avoid giving parts of the story, avoid saying things to one person and not to another, in part in terms of mind reading, and based on experiences that they've had, is that they don't want to have this problem, in part because of their own personal integrity, but also because, am I going to get them in trouble? Is the school going to get them in trouble? Is whoever? And so label avoidance has multiple causes, but it makes sense. And so it's important for me to be aware that that's there, and to try to understand and work with a kid about how they're interacting with me and sharing information with me. And the other one that's circled here is that all are the structures that are involved in stigma, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And these are the institutional practices and policies that support and promotes stigma. And to that question, I am kind of wondering, the way we sometimes talk about stigma, and wondering is, has stigma been diluted? This room will say something that some people will say, yes, of course, and some people might become a little bit uncomfortable, and that's okay, is stigma is inherently political. And I don't mean political necessarily by parties. This is actually not really a partisan thing. It can be, depending on what somebody's platform is and what they're trying to, something they're trying to get passed or what we're voting on. But any party can participate in stigma. So this is nonpartisan, and there's, like I said, it is inherently political. And part of our anti-stigma efforts oftentimes focus on, like I said, the more downstream effects, which have to do with behavioral expressions of distress that we have, which for many kids may involve substance use. So I put these some of these thought quotes up here from mostly from actually the first article that's listed below. But what I want to read out is, I'm asking myself and everybody along with me to consider processes of power and profit by gazing up the words from this resource to ascertain. So keeping in mind, who has created the stigma? Where is it created, by whom, and for whose benefit? Is it really benefiting kids? Is it really benefiting families, and in what way? And balancing it against who it may be benefiting more. I'm not going to say the who and the what. It's to get us to continue to ask a question. Do I honestly do this? I do this every time, even including down to practices that are considered best practices in the hospital and then in the clinic. I go, I really do is where's this coming from? How may this be part of stigma systems and who is benefiting from it? And does the kid in front of me benefit more from it than the systems do? Because my responsibility is to that kid, that family, and the community that they come from. Want to go back again for to self-stigma or internalized stigma. The way I think about it, I consider stigma to be oppression. And I have it written down here. To be oppressed and to be oppressive is to unjustly inflict hardship and constraint, especially on a subordinated group. That sounds a lot to me like stigma. So stigmatized persons are made, as Goffman said, to be tainted and less than whole and have diminished access to resources. That is hardship and constraint. Stigma then is oppression. And oppression, again, can be intentional and unintentional. At this stage in my career and in my life, while I actively want to act against this, I still, at different times, there's a push-pull and I participate in systems that may be part of stigmatizing machinery. And so part of my job and all of our jobs, if we engage in this, it's exhausting. But that's what part of what I have to do is remain mindful that I can participate in this even unwittingly until I make it known to myself. And so Stephen Biko, the anti-apartheid activist, had said the most potent weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. So once somebody who's a member of one of these groups internalizes the stigma process, that person begins to actually act against themselves on behalf of the stigma system. That was a lot. So we're going to pause for a second to take our phones out again. And now we're going to take out our phones and use our phones while driving. So please get your phones ready. First question. I'm not going to say everybody, but I'm assuming most of us on this webinar are driving at some point. I want you to think about the last time that someone cut you off in traffic. Why did they do it? Name the first two reasons that come to mind. And don't be shy. And the insanity filter is off. Great. Sorry, I'm laughing at their jerks and they're rushing to the hospital. Okay, for the person who missed the instructions, thank you for pointing that out. So if you look on the screen, if you take out your phone, open a web browser and navigate to menti.com, then you'll get prompted to put a code in. And you put that code in, and then you'll see this question pop up, and then you can start to type your answers in. So while these are continuing to scroll up, thanks again for participating. I love to see the balance of it. So number one, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next slide. Matter of fact, I'll just move to that now. Because I want to switch it now to we're the ones that are driving and we cut somebody else off. Why did you do it? And again, name the first one or two reasons that came to mind. Wonderful. This is wonderful. So as these are continuing to scroll up, number again, thanks again for participating and keep putting them in. You'll notice that there's a lot of overlap between the two, but there are also some differences. Apologize. Part of it is you'll notice that some of these are getting a little bit more wordy, right? Because there's more of the story, there's more of the narrative behind what was going on, right? And it's an oversimplification of to say attribution error, attribution bias, but there's this concept that many of us fall into at some point or another, not all the time, during these instances, especially driving, right? Sometimes we're kind of relaxed about it, sometimes we're not. Even if we are relaxed driving, it's a high stakes activity, right? And so, boom, when something happens, there's this tendency, number one, for us to go after things about somebody else's character. Not everybody did it. Some of us are in a frame of mind to kind of go, I get it. We're all in a hurry. Everything's fine. No harm, no foul. They're also, depending on what kind of state that we're in, will say things like, they're a jerk, they're a terrible driver. So it's like this one thing about them. And sometimes somebody I think put something about age. And so nobody has to admit too much about what thoughts they have, but people also have ideas like once they can see the driver or are making assumptions about the identity of that driver and they're all bad drivers. So stereotyping that happens. But the difference being, like I said, is when it's us, we have more immediate access to our narrative, to other aspects of the context of why the bad things happen. So I might have said, sorry, and I have an excuse. They had the same excuse too. And once we're able to chill out after it happens, oftentimes we're able to get to a place of going, they're subject to the same pressures that we are. So all that to say, when it comes to healthcare situations, particularly things like substance use, which are more complicated than straightforward straightforward medical condition, say, is it's easy to get pulled away by certain stereotypes and limit people to aspects of stereotypes and not remember other aspects of the story. We're talking about that a little bit. And if for people who are interested, all of the results of these can be shared with the group after the conference is over. So I want to shift again to say a little bit more about bias and where that can occur. Bias also occurs in science. So this idea that our science is objective is not entirely true, and happens at all levels of agencies, professions, people who have important power in determining how we talk about different things. And what the details are about different aspects of substance use. This is an article that came out this year, and this is in the conclusion section, and it was a study looking at the outcomes for babies up to 12 months who were exposed to buprenorphine naloxone, otherwise known as the brand name Suboxone, versus just naltrexone during that pregnancy. And the conclusion at the end begins completely accurately appropriate. Although there was no statistically significant difference. Then they go on to say more infants in the buprenorphine naloxone group. Anybody who has any familiarity with statistics will know that the reason that we do statistics the way that we do is recognizing that because we can't test every last person that occurs in both groups, we are subject to the limits of the group that we pull out. And we have a pretty good likelihood of pulling out a group that is weighted towards one group or another. So the statistic is there of that 0.05 or 0.01 level. I mean, 1 out of 100 versus 5 out of 100, the likelihood that I pulled this group by chance. And their statistics said that was likely. It was not a significant difference, but then went on to say more infants. So there is bias in there. And it's not good or bad, and it doesn't make them bad researchers, but it's to recognize that we're all subject to bias, even though, again, in the end, they reported their statistics, but they're saying the groups are different. The statistics are telling us the groups aren't different, more than due to chance. Now, they could go on, and it turns out they didn't go on to say that, no, there were no differences found, and we think we didn't power our study enough. We're going to do more to get more. It simply ended with this. And again, it isn't to malign people. It's just to say we're all susceptible to bias, and sometimes we show it. Another one that comes up quite a bit, you may have heard it, you may have said it, you may have read it in a bunch of informational sites or in people's articles, relates to marijuana. And I'm going to make more comments about marijuana in the next slide. And that is, I'll give you a detail particular, is associating marijuana use in youth with loss of IQ points. And there was an original study several years ago that came out that claimed that. And since that time, there have been a number of studies to refute that. So not only is it something that's debated, it's something that, as more research is that is fine-tuned and is really teasing this apart, it's really showing that that association, we cannot say that that association is there, that marijuana causes loss of IQ points. And yet, go ahead, take a look around. It's showing up in people's papers. It's showing up on very important informational websites. And all that, again, is not to call anybody out in particular, but to remind ourselves that all of us are susceptible to bias. And part of it may be just our inherent beliefs and values about things, but we're also influenced by our upbringing in terms of our not only what we're from, but how we're educated, what our professions are, what we've been exposed to, and so what we end up thinking that are actual facts. And so just to highlight, nobody's immune. No part of this process is anybody immune from bias. A little bit about marijuana ideology. Again, it makes people, it causes some tension for some people. It's inherently political, and substance use has been used for political reasons. Two major points in marijuana ideology and policy. With the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act around that time, and Henry Anslinger, who was the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics at that time, put out a number of quotes, many of which are far more offensive than this one. But marijuana is being taken by musicians, and I'm not talking about the good type, but the jazz type. They, by their own words, at that time, were particularly targeting people who were from Mexico and African Americans. And a lot of this was intended to target and further stigmatize groups. So we stigmatize substances and cross that over with other groups that have been marginalized or oppressed. And so whether we like it or not, it has been with intention. It's in our history. The paper that I recommend for people who haven't read is now 40 years old, From Killer Weed to Dropout Drugs. So this was a case where this person looked at both congressional hearings, other type of, official hearings, things that led to different policies, as well as what occurred in journalistic pieces. And bottom line is, we, out of kind of seemingly nowhere, we went from marijuana incited violence, sexual violence, rape, et cetera, to all of a sudden in the 60s and 70s, when young people who, yes, were engaging in more marijuana use, but also were fighting what they saw as an unjust war and protesting on campuses, all of it became the dropout drug. And that's where the first time we used a motivational syndrome came up. So it brings into question, one, the impact of just politicking on our concepts of substance use and their impact, but also how that guides what our thoughts are in medicine and behavioral health, as well as what guides research and the type of research questions that we ask. Little float some ideas out there. Disease and disorder as pharmacon. Using pharmacon sort of generously. Pharmacon, when we think about Plato, who originally talked about it, he was talking about written word and basically how it was sort of destroying thought and creativity. But what was also stated, and it's used more often in talking about critical theory, is the idea that this more than duality that we have, that some things that we have available to us can be a remedy or a help, and some things can be a poison. And we're very familiar with that in medicine, but I think we're familiar with that with things like different aspects of technological advances, et cetera. So what I'm leaving with this up here is not to say disease or disorder is a wrong way of thinking about this with kids, but leaving us with reasons to question both sides, rather than just deciding, here it is, here's what we have. And it's not all right, and it's not all wrong. There's a balance there. And the question I leave myself with, though, is that who does it benefit? Should it benefit kids? And should it benefit kids more than systems? Not everybody agrees on what that answer is, which is why I put the question out there. I want to make a little bit of a comment, which is, this is getting fresher and fresher. Our electronic records as stigma facilitators. One is problem lists. I just saw a kid 2 days ago, when I meet a kid, a 13-year-old, who has said to me, because he had two unique alcohol exposures, and came with, because it's really easy for us on electronic records to tag a diagnosis to somebody. I can delete it, but it's still there. And it's really hard to get things off of problem lists, and it's really hard to get it out of the way other colleagues now interact with that kid, especially if there are members of otherwise have other stigmatized or oppressed identities. And then I just want to throw it out there, data privacy. It's very different from the well over 20 years ago when I was a PEDS intern and asked to make sure that I talked to a kid about this subject area, but what we put in our notes. We put very little in our notes. And now there's a lot of TMI. And there's a lot of TMI about this kid that I just saw that I personally wouldn't have put in there, but now it's in there. And all of our data can go from the electronic record all the way to data brokers. And so to understand, we're in our infancy in terms of understanding what ends up happening with all of our data, but to know a couple of things. One, it's not that hard to re-identify data. And two, we already have evidence that people can be discriminated against. And it may not be individually, although it has been, but it's even by zip code. So the way information is collected. So we just can't begin to fathom yet what it might mean to really quickly put a label on a kid that may not be accurate, and may not be more helpful to put than not putting it and putting something else. So data privacy is something that we're going to have to continue to see what happens. That's all pretty overwhelming. Part of it can be like, look, a lot of it is system structure. What can I do about that? I don't say that we're going to have a revolution. Nobody in here today is going to make the system all be different tomorrow. And revolution isn't strictly necessary. In my view, it's these tiny resistances that come with my interactions with each other, with an individual kid, with an individual family, of these small resistances and small validations with patients and families and with each other that lend itself to meaningful change in the long run. So one that I do is I recognize that stigma is oppression. And again, it doesn't feel very good, but the fact is that's the impact on people. And so I recognize that impact of it. The other is I acknowledge it with kids and I name it. And part of it may be related to the substance use. A lot of it intersects with other experiences that they're having in their lives. The reason I have cross-outs here and up there is I like to leave my work on the board. And I used to put things like emphasize strengths and promote resilience. And you might be thinking, why would you cross that out? Because for me, it's important to not fall into a role of paternalism or patronizing. And so the way I like to frame things is I respect youth as experts on their own experience. It doesn't mean that I don't have facts to give them if I have. I mean, I have conversations with them all the time about, where Delta 8 THC actually comes from and the things that they may be exposed to. But it's very different to do that in the context of respecting them as individual beings where they are at this point in their life, and that they are more expert on their own experience than I am. And I look for ways constantly in which I may, as an individual, be contributing to institutional stigma. And that's it.